Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Productivity and Profitability webinar series funded by MLA. These webinar series are delivered, they deliver topics pertinent to beef and sheep and goat producers. My name is Hilary Beach and I work for the Webinar Coordinator's Home Circuit. Tonight's topic is updating sheep producers on the current status of drench resistance in worms. Just make the slide change. Just to give a little housekeeping to start with, you should see this control panel that will be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left of the control panel collapses and reinstates it. If you want to get a better view of your screen tonight, you should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. Please type your questions as Matt delivers the presentation tonight in the question box provided. Please make them as succinct as possible and I will relay them to Matt at the end of the webinar. So tonight we are lucky to be joined by Matt Playford, Dr. Matt Playford, sorry. He is a veterinarian who grew up in Cowra, the central west of New South Wales, and developed a love for livestock management and medicine working on mixed properties. After graduating from the University of Sydney, he worked in cattle and sheep production and reproduction and clinical practice before doing his PhD in parasitology at Hokkaido University. Sorry if I mispronounced that, Matt. He then worked at the Australian Embassy in Tokyo before returning to Australia to be manager of the University of Queensland's livestock teaching practice in Kenilworth, Queensland, and later research and technical manager at pharmaceutical company Intervet. Matt has been a veterinary consultant for 17 years and is the director of Dawbuts Proprietary Limited, a company that runs a parasitology laboratory and conducts research on behalf of the livestock industries. A lot of big words there, so I'm excited to hand over to Matt this evening. You should see something coming up soon, Matt.
Righto, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Hilary. And what I'm going to do is put my screen in the right place and then show my screen. And that will come on deck now, fingers crossed. Just let me know if you can see that screen.
Yep, looks great, Matt. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, well, look, welcome everyone. This is a big topic. There's a lot of variation around Australia, and I'm going to try to cover as much as we can for Southern Australia. But if you have specific questions, please feel free to shoot them through and just jot them down and send them in. Big thank you to Hilary and also to Sandy from Home Circuit, to MLA who's sponsoring this series as usual, and to all the participants, and thanks for staying up late. Rightio, well let's launch in and have a bit of a look at what's actually going on with the worm game, as we like to call it. As soon as we get going. Aha, here we go. We'll put this back on number 1 and we'll get started. Okay, so there's very clear principles of drench use, and they're summarised there. Now, looks very good paper, but how do we practically apply these principles? You know, drench when necessary, yeah. Use effective drenches, well, how do you know? Use combinations, well, what are they? Use chemical means. Let's just run through them in practical ways to sort out how to actually apply these on farm. So first and foremost, what are we looking at when we're talking about worms? If you open up the abomasum of a stomach, then you might see worms like this. These ones are barber's pole worms, Haemonchus contortus, and you can see that there they are writhing away in the stomach juices, and they suck 0.05 mils per female worm per day, and therefore a burden of only a few thousand worms can cause serious anemia. And that's the song that Janie Mitchell wrote about barber's pole worms, because she was so heartbroken when they actually attacked her lambs. Okay, so rule 1 is drench when necessary. Test sheep to know when. How do we test then? Let's look at some practical ways. The first way that they use a lot in South Africa is to look at the colour of the sheep. Now, you can look in several different places, but this low eyelid test, or the farmer charm method, was found to be the most reliable. It involves very gently pushing in the eyeball and allowing the third eyelid to come across, and then rolling the lower eyelid down so that you can see the colour of the mucous membrane of the third eyelid. And in South Africa, they've got very sophisticated ways of going through monitoring every individual sheep on a farm, and they can do that because they have access to cheap labour, more people working on a farm than in Australia, and they can assess each sheep and see if it needs drenching. Not really practical for us, but it's a good backup sometimes if you've got sheep in the yard anyway. Another really telltale sign is at the back end of the sheep, and this is for our southern friends, and there'll be a lot of people, I'm sure, who recognise the location where this photo was taken. The black scours that you get down the back end of the sheep that accumulates around their breech and all down their back legs is a good indication that those sheep have got scours from something. And it may very well be from worms, but how are we to really know? And then when you do a killer and you open up the sheep, you can have a look inside the intestines, and just as we saw in the first picture, the abomasum, where we see the brown stomach, brown stomach worm and the barber's pole worm, here we've got a bowel opened up, a large bowel, and we can see bowel worms in there. Not a really good indication of whether the sheep are sick or not, because these particular worms, the whipworms, don't really cause much damage. The other thing about looking inside is most of the worms that we're concerned about are really tiny, and they're hard to see even under the microscope, let alone by the naked eye. So we've got ways you can head down and pick up one of these worm egg test kits, and pick up some samples and put them into the test kit, pop them in the mail, and send them off to your favourite laboratory. Now, this is my favourite laboratory. This is Georgia, who is a worker in our laboratory, and she's preparing samples now for examining under the microscope. And there's Andrew and Phil, and they're counting. Andrew's actually counting fluke eggs there, and Phil is counting normal worm eggs under the microscope. Then we'll send you off a report, and the report looks something like this. So the first page will show all of the details, including the date and the date that the sheep were drenched, and the drench that was used, and other important information that we use to make a decision on drenching. Body condition score, time in paddock, age of the animals, and rainfall. Now, if you like, you could have a list as long as your arm of important features about the environment, the type of worms, the drenches, but we don't want you to take all day filling out forms, so we just limit it to these few features. And then the important part of the form is the worm egg count of the 15 animals and the type of worms that were there. And you can see the very bottom of the report there shows that we've got an average of 83 eggs per gram, and they were all Teladosagia or brown stomach Now, most people wouldn't be concerned about this, but this particular test was very concerning for us, and we contacted the owner because, you know, they were only drenched a short time ago, and here we are with 83 per gram, not particularly high worm egg count, but they're 100% brown stomach worm. Now, that's important because if they'd been picked up from the pasture, we'd almost all see a mixed infection. But when we see only a single species there, that's an indication that they have survived the drench. So even though this this particular farmer used a triple combination, we've got worms left over. So it's not enough to actually diagnose resistance, but it's enough to make you think, there might be a reason why we've got worms left over. Let's look at another result here. This is from 2019 ewe lambs, and they were drenched with Q-Drench on the 15th of January, and then tested again a month later. And they've got 343 eggs per gram. But if you look at the different worms there, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different species of worms. And that's an indication that these worms haven't survived the drench, been picked up after drench. So that's something that we just have to accept. They've been put back into a paddock that's had contamination levels sufficient to give them 4 different types of worms, and this is reinfection. So on this occasion, the drench worked, and looks like they've got recontamination. Now, you don't always have to send samples into the lab. I know a lot of people do have their own microscope and they're doing worm egg counts themselves. And the WormBoss WEC QA program is designed for people like that to ensure that you've got your technique right. So if you are interested, there's another round of QA program testing going on this year. So keep an eye out for that. And then another way is FECPAC. A lot of stores, vet clinics, and even big farms have put these in. And the idea with these is that you use the device that's like a great big microscopic camera, takes a photo of the worm eggs as they accumulate. This little video just demonstrates how you put your sample in, and the worm eggs all accumulate around a central place. And then it takes a photo on 5 different levels, pastes the photo together, and actually sends that off to the lab. So an experienced laboratory technician can give you your worm egg count and send it back in a report. And that enables you not only to be in touch with you know, your advisor or your vet or whoever gives you advice on drenching, because they get the report as well. Also enables you to collate information and use the techniques of big data. This is the sort of report you get from your FECPAC machine. And, you know, again, this is a very recent one where there were 630 eggs per gram of strongyles and 105 eggs per gram of Metodyrus for a combined total of 735 eggs per gram. So that's another very useful way of telling how many worms there are in a sheep. And because it's a new method, there hasn't been a lot of validation work going on, but we're quite encouraged by signs like this, which was a validation against the total worm count in lambs. There's a very high correlation there between the worm egg count that you get from FECPAC and the actual number of worms that were counted from those lambs. So good signs. Right, so we worked out there are different ways, accurate ways of determining when to drench the sheep. Now let's think about what to drench them with. So we've got a very nice mob of merino ewes here, and we want to drench them. So we'll go to the drench locker and find out for the principle. Well, rule number 2 is use effective drenches, and the definition in Australia for an effective drench is 95% worm kill or 95% efficacy. Now, of course, we'd like it to be as high as possible, but over time, drenches tend to develop resistance, and so 95% is a very sound, practical target to aim for an effective drench. how do we work out how well a drench works? Well, we can do a drench test. And here's Dave. He lives in southern tablelands of New South Wales, and he's setting up a drench test. First, he picks up very fresh samples. These are less than 10 minutes old from sheep that have been in his yard. And then he drenches the sheep with a couple of different drenches, and drenches 15 sheep in each mob. You can see he enjoys drenching sheep. And then he gets a willing helper to identify which sheep went into which mob. So, for example, this sheep was treated with moxidectin, so she gets a blue tag on her head. And then 2 weeks later, Dave goes along and he takes some samples. So he'll take a sample from the sheep from the that had the blue head, and he'll put her in the tray. It's got blue written on it. And so take the samples and put them in the tray for all the blue sheep, and then those samples go back to the lab. And here we've got Adriana and Phil testing those samples to tell you how well each drench has worked. A very simple process, and if you don't want to go through different groups and mark the sheep, you can just do it for a single drench. And if you're doing a single drench, all you're doing is the same technique. You don't even have to obtain the samples directly from the sheep's backside. You can actually do it just by drenching the sheep and then picking up the samples again off the ground, as long as they're fresh samples. Okay, and this is the sort of report that you get after you've done a drench test. So this drench test was in September 2019, and day 0 means the day that they were drenched. And you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species of worms there. The key underneath the second table there tell you what the common names of those worms are. A couple of key things we like to know when we look at worm drench results. The first one is the average starting worm egg count. Now, essentially the higher the better, because it gives you more reliable results, but we've got more sensitive methods these days, and we're very successfully doing very rigorous testing for about 200 or 300 eggs per gram starting. These have got 97, so more than enough. They've also got a nice natural infection with 5 different species of worms. When we look at the efficacy of the different drenches, we can see that we've got a problem with Telodosargia, brown stomach worm, and even very strong drenches like Mectin and moxidectin have only got 53%, 54% efficacy against Telodosargia. Now, this isn't uncommon. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of brown stomach worm in Australia, particularly the southern areas, that are resistant to the ML class, the ivermectin, moxidectin. We sort of expect it to be resistant to BZs, the white drenches, and levamisole, the clear drenches. But this is a bit of an unwelcome trend that's occurring more and more often. And the other drenches there, the triple and the monipant, which is Zolvix, are working at 100%. So that's very, very fortunate. Right, so then we get to combination drenches. Now, this is that last drench test was from South Australia. This one's from Western Australia, and we had such poor results from the individual drenches that when we worked out what their efficacy was against the brown stomach worm, Telodosargia, it was a bit shocking. So all of the combinations we worked out had very low predicted efficacy against Telodosargia. So unfortunately, the combination drenches won't work too well on this farm. Right, so what to do then? Let's have a look at some more big trends that are happening. This is back on farm and more drenching. And we'll get to another drench test. So this particular one, 2,290 eggs per gram. That's pretty high. That's getting up there, and some of those sheep had a burden up around 6,000 eggs per gram. This is in March 2019, so early autumn, when the Barber's pole worms are really starting to build up, and we see that 97% of the worms in this zero test were Barber's pole worms. When we look at the results, we can see that in the different treatment groups, we've got problems with Closantel, which is a worry because Closantel's a really good product against Barber's pole worm, but it's not a terrible problem. So it's 92%, which is pretty reasonable. And when you put Closantel in combinations, of course, it works better. So Closantel's mostly used in combinations, and it's still a very handy drench against Barber's worm. Ivermectin is not going too well. See that zero there? That's an indication that it's fallen a heap on a particular farm. Moxidectin, which is a very popular drench for good reason, is only working at 70%. So again, this guy needs to, or this particular producer needs to get onto some combination drenches. Here's another one with a lot of Barber's pole. Starting worm egg count is 1,000. And when we look at the results, we can see that none of those drenches are working too well. Yes, we've got a good result with Vamazole against Barber's pole worm, but it doesn't really work that well against brown stomach worm. It's not until we look at the new drenches, and that's StarTect and Zolvix. So the one's actually Zolvix Plus. You can see we use the code MON Plus, which refers to Monipentel plus Ivermectin, and StarTect, of course, is Urquantel plus Ivermectin. They're working at 100% against both of these, the most problematic worm in Australia, and that's a pretty reliable trend across Australia. StarTect and Zolvix Plus are working at 100% or close to it in almost all the drench tests that we do, despite the others not doing too well. Okay, so here we are back in our drench locker, and so we're thinking, gosh, we probably shouldn't be using these single active drenches anymore. We should be moving on to combination drenches. So let's have a look at another drench test. This one is from October 2019. Good spread of worms here. This one's from South Australia, so they've got lots of different types of worms there. And the starting worm count is 643 egg per gram. And when we look at the results, we can see that the brown stomach worm is a bit of a problem, but the Zolvix kills it. And the Barber's pole worm is killed by Levamisole, and the Zolvix and the others don't quite get there. Now, when we look at the fourth worm name there, that's other, we can see that this particular farm had 26% Cuperia. And when we look at the results there, all of the drenches killed the Cuperia 100%. So that's a happy result there. Cuperia isn't that common in sheep in Australia, but when it does appear, it's often because the paddock's been co-grazed or grazed after cattle. So there's a little bit of crossover there. Okay, so you've probably guessed what rule 3 is already. Use combination drenches, and the reason is simply that they kill more worms and they last longer. So There's slower onset of resistance when you use combinations, and they just kill more worms, simply because of the additive effect of the different active ingredients in a combination drench. Now, as we've seen, there are examples where some farms, where particularly brown stomach worm and barber's pole worm, won't be killed by a triple, and they're still fairly rare, but they're a lot more common than we'd like. And so we are doing a lot of testing now for triple to find out how that trend is going. So what do we do with this mob of sheep? Well, they've just arrived off the truck, and we're going to give them a quarantine drench. And the recommendation for a quarantine drench is that you give 4 active ingredients, including one of the new ones. So one of the new ones being either dequantal, which is in StarTect, or monipantal, which is in Zolvix Plus. You can give both, but they're both a bit more expensive than the other drenches. So you can back them up with a second drench, which is a BZ, the white drench, and levamisole. I've shown them both there in 2 different drums, but you can get them in the same drum, of course, in products like Scan or DuoCare. So that's what your quarantine drench should look like. Now, if you're not using the quarantine drench, then you should take yourself into the room of mirrors and go and have a good long hard look at yourself, because you could be importing these resistant worms, which are found more and more all over Australia, and you probably want to reset the resistance and have at least clean paddocks when those sheep come in. There's another rule, and that is the rule actually says use short-acting drenches in preference, long-acting drenches, but a lot of people now are using long treatment, and they are very important for some applications, especially when you have contaminated paddocks. And so the rule then gets changed a little bit to long-acting treatments need a primer, which is an effective drench given at the time of the long-acting injection or even the capsule, and an exit drench, which is given usually around 7 to 8 weeks, but depending on how long that long-acting treatment works. And the best way to work out when to give an exit drench is to do another worm egg count. Now, you can do it sequentially for a very long period of time, or estimate with the benefit of your advisor when's the best time to do that worm egg count and work out when you need to give the exit drench. For ewes that are given a long-acting treatment pre-lambing, often that will be at either lamb marking or at weaning. So there's rule number 5. And rule number 6 is use non-chemical worm control methods. Now, the news is that droughts are generally good for worm control, but it's not always the case, and sometimes sheep, particularly if they're in confinement, will actually develop reasonable worm burdens, especially if they're not given an active drench. The other complicating thing about having non-chemical worm control methods is that there's a few places. This photo was taken in Yorkshire, where they've got green grass all year round, and I know a lot of parts of New Zealand are like this, but in Australia tend to be a lot more seasonal, and the Mediterranean climates in South Australia and Western Australia are, of course, are very good examples of this. So we have to actually come to terms with our environment and work out the best way, and of course the local knowledge is the best guide to this, that we can utilise the environment to control worms without having to smash our drenches all the time. Okay, so Joni Mitchell, again, she was saying that everyone used the right drenches to kill all the worms. She knew it wasn't going to hurt the birds and the bees, and that is probably the emotional response to all her lamb being killed. So getting back to the general principles of drench use, there they are listed, but if you want to read more about them, you should go and have a look at WormBoss, which is the authority in Australia for all things to do with sheep worms, and there's a lot of information there, so you can drill down as deep as you want, or you can just take the top line information to do things like go in and solve your current worm problem, and that will actually enable you to make a decision about not only which drench, but which drench to use. So I highly recommend that you have a look at WormBoss. So I hope you've got something out of the last 30 minutes talking about the worm game, and I'm happy to take any questions. Back to you, Hilary.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Great presentation. And I hope everyone's reinvigorated about their worm control and drenching and can get in the yards and enjoy it like Dave did. So thank you. I'll just give Matt a little bit of a break. If you do have to jump off early, please make sure you fill out the survey that will pop up when you exit the webinar. These surveys help us deliver your feedback back to MLA and to Home Circuit and to the presenters like Matt to make sure that we're hitting the right notes when we're delivering the content. I will also say these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website under, or you might just have to Google it, Google MLA webinars, and you'll be able to find it. So please send through your questions for Matt, and we'll get started on them now. The first one, Matt, is from Oliver. If I use a short-acting pre-lambing combination drench, such as TriGuard, how long can I keep them in contaminated pastures before set stocking in clean pastures for lambing?
Yeah, good question, Oliver. And because the word contaminated can be used to describe 100 larvae per kilogram of dry matter through to 50,000 larvae per kilogram of dry matter. And so we don't know how long it's going to take those used to actually develop another reasonable worm burden. Generally, you can get about 3 weeks out of a short-acting drench. If you're in a fairly clean paddock, then it will take them, if they're on good nutrition, another couple of weeks to develop a reasonable worm. However, the higher the barber's pole worm percentage, then the more dangerous they become, because you can get even larval worms sucking blood and causing a lot of grief to that mob even before they start laying eggs. So it would be a good idea to pick up some samples from those used to check, and also based on past history of the paddock that you're putting them into, work out whether it's a on a scale of 1 to 10, whether it's a highly contaminated paddock or if it's a zero paddock, which means it's been spelled for a very long time.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Hope that helps, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Oliver. The next one from James. Matt, can we have your thoughts on barber vacs?
Yeah. Well, look, barbacs is a very useful tool in areas where we have a fairly constant and predictable challenge from barber's poleworm. And the reason why it's probably not adopted more is because it does take a bit of work. When you first use it, you're mustering lambs and you're giving them a vaccination at lamb marking, and then 3 weeks later, and then probably at weaning, and then another couple of weeks after that. So 4 vaccinations, and then they've got good protection. Now, for people who are able to muster, and that doesn't sound like too much of a burden, then it's an excellent tool. And we have found that people who are using it are getting very good control of the barbless poleworms over time. Now, the reason this is critically important is because once barbless poleworms get on a paddock, they're very hard to get off, and you can actually store paddocks for a period of time, and the barbless poleworm larvae are still surviving there for one reason or another. Even over winter, when we think they're being frozen, they just go up there and they come back as soon as the weather's a bit warmer, even on a warm day. So Barbavax is a very useful tool. You should probably look at how constant your challenge is from barbless poleworm, and then consider the cost and how easy it is for you to muster before you commit to it.
Thanks, Matt. The next question from Frank, and I will also add with these types of questions, is that all the comments that Matt makes tonight should be backed up by your local vet or animal health provider. So make sure that you consult with them before administering products. So Frank wants to know, how effective is Ivermec and Cydectin in combination?
Not really, because when they work in combination, they still have the same mode of action. And so we find if the worms are resistant to one, then they have at least a degree of resistance to the other. Now, when we did our big national survey of drench resistance in sheep, we found there were some places where ivermectin was gone, it was 100% resistance, and moxidectin was still working reasonably well. So moxidectin definitely has higher efficacy most of the time, probably due to its potency. But using them in combination doesn't really solve anything, because it works on worms' same molecules and the same receptor on those molecules, and therefore if you get resistance to one, you're getting resistance to the other.
Thanks, Matt. The next one from Scott. If a worm egg in pregnant ewe is negligible, why use a primer before Cydectin LA pre-lambing?
Yeah, well, if you had very low worm eggs, Scott, then there may be a good case not to use it. But if that was the case, then you'd probably think, why are you using an LA at all? Because you could probably get away with using short-acting drenches and maybe doing a bit more paddock control. So yeah, there's two ways of looking at that.
Great, thank you, Matt. The next one from Steve, which is interesting. What's happening on the R&D front with breeding non-resistant worms to reintroduce and use of biowormers and the use of biowormers? What role does iodine element play as a natural defense? Have a go at that, if you can, Matt.
All right, thanks, Steve. That's a triple bunger, so I'll have a crack at them one by one. So the research on susceptible worms replacing resistant worms, and there's been good attempts to do this, and research that's tried to show if it can be done. All of them have actually showed no, it can't be done. And so if someone's claiming that it can be done without showing you good evidence, then you can probably turn off your hearing aid and turn them a deaf ear, because all the legitimate research around the world has essentially showed that it hasn't worked. It would be a great idea if it did work, but unfortunately it hasn't. Second one is bioworm. And now bioworm does work, and if anyone hasn't heard of bioworm, it's based on a principle that you feed the sheep live fungi. It's a fungus that's already been commercialized, used in other biological control, called Dudding flagrans, and then it actually works on the on the worm eggs or the larvae and kills them before they get a chance to reinfect the sheep. So it does work, and we know it actually reduces the larval burden on pasture by about 70%. You need to give it every day in the feed, and so that's a bit of a challenge for most producers. And the other thing is, because it's a fungus, it does work under conditions that are good for growing mushrooms. And if you've got a dry paddock or a paddock that's not very suitable for fungal growth, then you probably won't get as good an effect. And the third one was iodine. Iodine does kill the worms, but it probably does also have a very negative effect on other soil microbes. So I would not recommend using iodine as a way of controlling larval worms on pasture. But keep those ideas coming, Steve. That's exactly the sort of thing we should be considering.
Great, thanks for the question, Steve. The next one from Berwin, would you be able to tell us, Matt, where you can get a copy of the worm game? Is it on the Strategic Bovine Services? Do they have it online? I think it might be the photo that you're using there.
Oh, Baron, yeah, wouldn't that be great? No, we'll have to see if someone wants to commercialise it and make it available, because it was used, and there are a lot of people around Australia who are probably looking at that and laughing, because they've actually thrown the dice and worked their worms around the board and seen them get resistance and get pushed back into the larval pad. But no, it's not available, I'm afraid. So if you've got a commercial offer, I'm all ears.
Sounds great. I just have a question. I'm not sure if you went through it at the start, Matt, but could you just go through drench resistance trends, or recap if you already did?
Yeah, okay. So trends in drench resistance are that all of the single active drenches, apart from the new ones, have got reasonably high levels of resistance now, depending on your area, to the three major worms. So the three major worms, of course, a barber's pole worm, which are red because they suck blood, brown stomach worm, brown for some reason, and then black scour worm. So we've got a red worm, we've got a black worm, we've got a brown worm. Now they're found right throughout Australia in sheep areas, particularly across southern Australia, and they are all nasty worms. They've all developed resistance against all of the single active drenches, apart from the new ones. So the new ones, Dequantel, Artect, and Monipantel in Zolvix, still work at 100% or close to it most of the time. The other trend is we're seeing more and more brown stomach worm that are resistant to the mectins. So that is ivermectin, abamectin, moxidectin. And that means that because there's already very long established resistance to the white drenches and the clear drenches, those three drenches are the components of triple. So if we've got severe resistance to brown stomach worm with MLs, then it means that the triples won't work. So it's worth testing your triples, and the easiest way to do it is to do a worm egg count and a larval diff, which is a way of identifying the worms 14 days after treatment. So if you use a triple, 14 days after treatment, take samples from those same sheep, send them to the lab. They should be able to tell you how well that drench is working, particularly if you take another sample on the day of treatment that you can compare it against.
Great, thank you, Matt. The next one from Gary. Matt, what are your thoughts about cattle pour-ons versus injectables?
Well, Gary, it's an open and shut case for me. I recommend injectables over pour-ons 100% of the time. And there's very good reason for it. The injectables work better, they're safer, and they're more sustainable. They don't select for resistance in the same way that the pour-ons do. Now, having said that, the pour-ons for the last 30 years have been probably the best products you could have. So I'm not saying that they're not good. I'm just saying that injectables better. So forgive me for that, Gary. Unless you've got a really bad set of yards and it's an occupational health and safety problem, and you need to use pour-ons for that reason, you should be choosing an injectable every single time. And you know, there may be one or two other reasons why you choose a pour-on, particularly if you're hunting a particular type of lice. But apart from that, injectable.
Great, thank you for that one that just slipped in there. The next one from John, are your recommendations for primer and tail drench the same for controlled release capsules as for LA injection?
Oh, look, yeah. Now this is a good one. So for a primer and an exit drench, you can use anything as long as it's effective. So we want, and look, a lot of my motivation for this is seeing ewes that have been treated with a long-acting treatment without a primer, very, very sick, only 6 weeks after treatment, and you know, huge burdens of barber's poleworm. And the reason is because they had resistant barber's poleworm, and in the past, before the resistance onset, you know, the producers thought, oh well, yeah, just use the LA because it says here on the label that it kills all the barber's poleworm. Now, once resistance comes on, the LA works in that it stops the incoming larvae coming through, but it doesn't kill the worms that are already there. So any effective drench. Now you can actually use one of the new drenches, StarTech or Zolvix Plus, for example, knowing that they're going to work, or you can take advantage of the fact that you can use a duo, such as, you know, Scander or one of those other drenches that have got a BZ and levamisole in it, at the same time as you give the long-acting moxidectin. For capsules, it's a little bit harder because often in the areas where they use capsules, you don't have such a pronounced worm burden at the start, and barber's pole might be as big a problem. So I can understand you know, thinking that they may not be necessary, because the main reason for a capsule is to prevent the incoming larvae from establishing over the time period of the capsule. For using both of these drenches, the exit drench is again critical, and this time I suggest you use the most effective drench that you can get. And the reason is because once the resistant worms accumulate in the stomach of all those sheep, they're pushing out resistant eggs that turn to resistant larvae, which will then infect the lamb. So you want to make sure that you chop off the supply of those resistant worms by using a very effective drench. And again, you know, you should be doing a drench test now and again to work out which drenches are effective. And if you haven't done a drench test, then you've got a pretty good guarantee that the effective ones are going to be, again, the new products.
Great.
It's a bit complex, John. I hope that made sense.
Yep, let us know if you need further clarification, John. The next one from Brian, Matt, is there any resistance that you know of to organophosphate drench, i.e. Polax?
Polax, yeah. So organophosphate is really only directed at barber's pole worm, and look, there probably is a bit of resistance. And the other thing you see is sometimes you get worm egg counts after the use of the organophosphate, and it could be simply because it doesn't kill the immature worms as well as the adults. So it might kill the adults and then not the immatures. There is a little bit of resistance, yes, but don't write it off simply because you know, you're getting a count afterwards, particularly in autumn as the you know, high worm burdens build up on the pasture. You could be getting large numbers of larvae activating and laying eggs afterwards. So it's important to just bear that in mind when you do a drench test for with an organophosphate. And just for anyone wanting to use an organophosphate, they are a product that you need to use very cautiously and carefully. And I think there's a lot of people with more experience of this than me, but it's quite easy to end up with sick or dead sheep after the use of an organophosphate. So use them cautiously, and in particular, try and get them out of the paddock into the yards, you know, in reasonable time, as in without too much delay in the yard. Use the drench and then get them back into the paddock and with feed and water as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Brian. The next one from Gary, and then I have one more, and that's it for tonight, unless you get in quickly. At what temperature will worm larvae be reduced to more than 95% during the summer months, and to what degree will the reduction be?
Yeah, this is a great question, Gary, because there's been research done in Armidale by our good friends at the University of New England that showed that at different temperatures, the worm larvae have got different survival rates. So the higher the temperature, the faster their metabolism, and so they run out of energy very quickly. And that's because the larvae that are on grass, they're third stage larvae, and when they molt from the second stage, they actually have the cuticle of the second stage still around them, and that's to protect them from drying out, but it also stops them from feeding. So there they are, living on the grass or in the soil. They can't feed, they can't actually replace energy that they use up. So if it gets hot every day, they wriggle, use up all their energy, and then they just eventually run out of energy. And so the again, the best place to look for this graph is on the WormBoss website, and you see all the details there of the different temperatures and then the different length of time it took to get down to 90% kill or attrition of those third stage larvae. So without wishing to be cute, I'll refer you to that WormBoss website to have a look at that, because that's a much better source of information than me trying to remember all the different temperatures.
No worries. So, yeah, again, that's the WormBoss website. The next one from Luke, Matt, further to the question on injectables versus pour-ons, where do you rate an oral on that scale, and do you recommend a combination product due to increasing mectin resistance in cattle? Lots of cattle questions tonight. Sorry, Matt.
No, that's all right. This is a topic again that's very close to my heart. Orals tend to work very well against the stages of worms that are in the lumen, which is, you know, the stomach and the small intestine. And they possibly don't work as well as the stages that are encysted up in the mucosa, or that have crawled up into the mucosa. In particular, we're talking about you know, the type 2 Ostatagia in cattle, which is the brown stomach worm. So for calves, you know, I'd be very happy to use an oral, and a combination oral. Of course, the principle is the same as in sheep. Combination oral is probably going to work better than a single active. But the downside is they don't have any persistent activity, and they may not work as well against type 2 Ostatagia. So I'd really emphasize the fact that drench choice really is horses for courses. There's a lot of very good drenches there available, and you have to select the ones right for your situation. The best way is to find out a little bit more about the worms that are present, as well as the animal types.
Okay.
Hope that answers that one, Luke.
Thanks, Luke. And the last question for this evening from Andrew. Matt, what are your thoughts on Weaner Guard and U-Guard?
Okay, well, look, without naming specific products, I've outlined in the results we've seen, and we seriously have done hundreds of drench tests over the last few years, mostly from Southern Australia, that we have seen quite a lot of resistance to single active. So if using U-Guard or Weaner Guard, they're injectable moxidectin, and they have worked very, very well in the past, but may not work as well now. So I'd really be encouraging you to do a 2-week count to see if they're still working well. Convenient product, and they have worked very well in the past. Just check them to see, because we do have resistance now to moxidectin in brown stomach worm and Barber's pole worm that's fairly widespread.
Excellent. Oh, and we've just had one come in quick. This is the last question for tonight, everyone. Should ivermectin, given the poor results, be one of the 4 actives for your quarantine drench?
Look, I've probably from that group of half a dozen drench tests deliberately pulled out some poor ivermectin results. It's not always bad news for ivermectin. The funny thing about ivermectin is that it is quite a potent molecule, and it also has very short residual time in the animal's body, and so that's what makes it such a good molecule to be paired with both monimantle and dequantal, and so that's why it is included in both Zolvix Plus and in StarTech. So whether it's the best choice or the ideal choice or not, it's there. So one way or another, it's going to do the job on all of the black sour worm that through, because they're still quite susceptible to ivermectin. And if you want to make up your own quarantine drench that doesn't use it, then that's definitely up to you. But it's quite a convenient thing to do, to choose either Zolvix Plus or StarTech, and then team that up with one of the dual products, the duo, the BZ plus levamisole products.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks so much for those questions, everyone, and a big thank you to Matt for presenting tonight and answering all those questions. It was a pleasure to have you, and there are many people typing in now saying thank you for the webinar, Matt. So we had a really good turnout. So that's all for this evening, and we'll talk to you at the next webinar.
Thanks, Hilary.